Story 1. I have been on patrol for several years and love stuff like this. I had a backup officer with me who witnessed everything. Dispatch sent me on a call in a mountain area late one night. Dispatch said the caller reported several people holding a baby above their heads and chanting. While standing on her property, the call sounded ridiculous and I smirked as dispatch gave the details. I arrived at the proper address after driving about 20 minutes along a mountain road. There is not much else up here, and it was extremely quiet. No one walks around out here and there aren't very many cars driving this late. I walked along a gated driveway through a light wooded area. I found the caller's house with two dim lights near the front door. The house was surrounded on three sides by heavy woods. I felt a little uneasy just looking at the house. I knocked on the front door of the house while standing on a large patio. I heard something move to my left, which startled me because it was close. It sounded like a person, something big. I looked to the left and used my flashlight to light up the patio. I didn't see anyone. I continued to knock. I could hear two voices inside the house. I clearly heard a male and a female. This made me feel a little better. I thought I heard someone on the patio, but it must have been someone inside. The female eventually opened the door. She was terrified, almost crying. She asked me to come inside and to close the door. She led me to the living room, where I saw a very cheap security monitor, almost like a baby monitor camera setup with audio and video playing. The camera setup only provided a live feed. The camera was positioned to view the front door and patio area where I was just standing. The audio was silent as I watched the monitor for a few seconds. The woman began to explain when I interrupted and asked where the male was inside the house. I heard his voice. She looked confused and said she was here alone. I was surprised because I know for a fact I heard a male's voice when I knocked. I asked her several times and initially thought she was lying to me. My partner checked the house and did not find anyone. The woman said she was reading while sitting on the couch when she heard something over the security camera. She looked at the display and saw two people on the patio standing at the front door. She heard knocking at the door and called the police. I looked at the monitor, and although it was low quality, I could see the patio and front door area with decent clarity. As the woman continued to explain, the audio on the monitor went from quiet to extremely loud. We all stopped talking. The caller was shaking. I looked at the monitor but didn't see anyone. Loud audio continued to blast from the speakers. The audio sounded like wind, but it was not windy that night. I asked the woman, "What is that?" And she said, "It's them." I looked at my partner, who was nervous. The woman gave me her cell phone, stating she took pictures of the monitor, showing the two people on her patio. I looked through several low-quality pics and didn't see anything. I continued to scroll, and sure enough, I see what looks like two tall figures standing at the door. One of the figures is holding something. The figures looked strange, all dark and featureless, in contrast to the video I saw on the monitor. I was in disbelief and thought, "Oh my God, she's telling the truth." I continued to scroll and saw one figure holding something up over its head. Another picture showed the item at the base of the door with both figures standing near it. I tried to reason, to explain what could have caused these images, but it was pretty apparent that there had been two subjects on her patio. We check outside, walking the property to the tree line. I mention the movement on the patio and the male voice from inside the house. My partner asks me to stop talking about it. We finish checking and return to speak with the caller. She says she will be driving into town and staying at a hotel because she is too scared to stay here tonight. We walk along the driveway back to our cars. My partner jumps into the patrol car and takes off. I laughed, but I felt really uneasy, standing there in the dark. I leave shortly afterward. Story 2. My dad was in the police force for 20 years, and when he was just a rookie, he had to conduct nighttime roadblocks meant to catch drunk drivers. They had done it many times before, and this night started routine enough for them. That was until this Toyota Corolla drove up to them with what looked like a white blanket on its roof, flapping in the wind. They thought it was weird, but did not see anything amiss about it. One of them even joked that this guy was multitasking by drying his laundry and driving home at the same time. The laugh stopped when the lone car came closer, and all of them saw what looked like a woman in white lying face down on top of the car. The woman seemed to slide like a slug backward until she disappeared behind the car as it eventually came to a stop in front of them. It took a few minutes for my dad's team to recompose themselves as they stared at each other as if to say, "You guys saw that, right?" The most senior of them finally stepped up and shot the usual questions to the driver. There was a noticeable quiver in his voice as he made conversation and asked him to step out of the vehicle. My dad's team inspected the whole vehicle, including the boot, and found nothing strange in it. The driver was a good-looking staff sergeant in the Army who was heading home from a company event earlier that night and admitted to having had a few cans of beer. He said he laid down in his bunk to sleep it off, hence why he was driving home at that time. It was 4 a.m. He passed their sobriety test and they started to ask him if he saw anything weird during his drive. Initially he said no, but after more questioning he mentioned that he had to swerve to avoid what looked like a bird that was flying upside down. It was spooky, but didn't think that was a detail worth sharing with police officers. The senior then told the guy to chill out at a 24-hour coffee shop before heading home. The locals believe that if a malevolent spirit follows you, making a pit stop confuses them so they can't set up shop in your house. After some confusion of his own, the driver finally caught on and nodded in agreement. After the guy leaves, they call into the station and cut the night short. Never knew what happened to the driver. Hope he's all right. Story 3. When I was 19 to 21 years old, I was employed as a security enforcement officer through a local private investigator firm. I know I wasn't technically the LE you're asking for, but I've always wanted someplace to share this story. I spent a 12 p.m., 12 a.m. shift at an upscale theater, and then my boss called me and told me I was assigned to a YMCA construction site that everyone kept calling out from. The sooner I could come in, the better, he said. So, after working 12 hours at the theater, I spent another few hours at that site. By the time I arrived home, it was around 9:30 and I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. But I received a phone call. It was my brother. His birthday was that day and I had completely forgotten about it. My whole family and I went shopping around and then ate at a restaurant about 45 minutes from my house. At around 1 p.m. I told them I had to leave because I just couldn't keep my eyes open. As I was driving home, no amount of music or driving with the windows down would keep my eyes open. I started drifting into the opposite lane of traffic. I decided it was best if I pulled over. I looked around, and there was an ice cream shop, so I stopped in. It was a weird place for it to be because the highway I was driving on was a smaller country highway, and it was on the outskirts of town. So, an odd place to put a shop that would seem to rely on foot traffic. There was a woman out front asking if I had stopped for ice cream. I didn't want to be a dick and just tell her I wanted a nap, so I said yes. I went inside and it was rather junky. It looked like they bought furniture from old barbecue restaurants and threw it at random into the building. The same woman was now behind the counter. I said I wanted 2 scoops of chocolate on a cone and pulled out my bank's debit card. "We don't take cards here," she said. She handed me the ice cream cone. I dug around in my pockets and went back to my truck for change. I never keep anything but a debit card on me, but I found about 50 cents, and I gave it to her. She said the price was $1.80, but that'll do. I didn't know what else to do because I was half asleep and she had given me the ice cream cone already. Despite the fact I was attempting to pay with a debit card as she was making it, I said thanks and walked outside to stand and eat it. I'm a pig when I eat, so by the time I made it to my truck, I had some already on my face and uniform. Before I could make it to my truck, the woman walked outside to talk to me. "You look troubled," she said, "but whatever you're going through, you'll be fine." I get in my truck and leave this, I'm now assuming, batshit crazy ice cream vendor. I get home and fall asleep. The next day I'm getting my uniform ready when I see chocolate ice cream on my uniform shirt. The ice cream shop wasn't far away from my house, so I felt I should go pay her what I owed. I pulled up to the building, but it was locked. Their building was empty and there was a sheet of dust caked over the doors like no one had touched them in years. Story 4. I'm Officer Bradley. I retired from the force 10 years ago at the ripe age of 50. I'll begin with a story from my 20 years as a police officer that stuck with me like a deep thorn. January 17th, 2005. We got a call about a woman who had locked herself in her bathroom. She said her boyfriend was trying to kill her. My partner Mason and I arrived at a house at the end of a street. The lamp posts flickered yellow, and the wind danced the trees and bushes. The clouds were thick and the air ice cold. We took a position at the front door. We knocked. "Police, open up." Only the sound of wind chimes. Mason kicked the door open with all the force he could muster. We scanned the house downstairs. No one in sight, clear. "You hear that?" I said. Mason looked up at the stairs. Gentle cries, a woman. So subtle and as if muffled behind a door, in a room. "Thought she was supposed to be downstairs," said Mason. We made our way upstairs. "Ma'am, it's okay," I began. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The crying stopped abruptly as if someone hit a pause. Then it started again. "But he's still here," replied the woman from inside the bedroom. "My partner and I checked the entire house. No one's here, ma'am. You're safe." Downstairs, the front door slammed shut. My partner and I gave each other a gaze, and I could notice his brow sweating despite the cold night. I used my head to gesture for him to take a look. He stood from atop the stairs and looked down at the front door. "Just the wind, I think," he said. Then a gentle voice came from inside the bathroom. "Are you sure, Officer Bradley?" the woman asked. The entire night at that scene, neither my partner Mason nor I used our names out loud. Not once. "Ma'am, do you need help or not?" Mason was agitated. "We need to know you're okay, so step back because I'm kicking it in." A part of me believes Mason was more eager to see the woman's face, to find out who she was and how she knew what she did than he was for her safety. He wanted peace of mind. "No, hold on, I said. "She might be sitting right by the door. We don't want to hurt her." Then she said it. "Officer Bradley, tell Mason that if he touches this door, I will visit his family in the late hours of a certain night and break down a door of my own." The woman's voice was an octave deeper when she said that. I never understood the expression, "white as a ghost." Do people actually turn that pale in the face? I learned that they in fact did when I saw my partner react to those sinister words. I couldn't stop him from kicking in that bedroom door this time, but when he did, we found nobody inside. There wasn't a window above the shower through which to escape or another door to go through. And yet, we were certain that we just had a full conversation with a woman behind this door. We scanned the entire house, including the backyard, one last time, inch by inch. Nothing. My partner and I communicated non-verbally the rest of the night. So when it was time to leave, we gave each other a look and left the house without even looking back. Now this is the part of the story I haven't told anyone, not even Mason. We were sufficiently disturbed, so I didn't want to tell him what I was about to tell you. When we left the house, I drove us back to the station that night. He probably thought I didn't notice, but his hands were shaking too much to drive comfortably. He doesn't drink coffee. As I reversed the cruiser out the street, Mason didn't look back at the house. But the truth is, I did, and I sincerely wish that I hadn't. I looked and squinted at a garbage can by the side of the house to see a strange, dark figure kneeling by the gate, as if watching us leave. Story 5. I'm a detective and spent some time as an expert on sex crimes and crimes against children. It was the best, worst assignment I've had. In one case, I had come in at midnight. A young woman with a toddler comes into one of the precincts to report her ex-boyfriend raped her during a custody argument. Long story short, it was legit and one of the most violent and sadistic cases I've ever had, so I'll spare the gruesome details. I still have no idea how this woman made her own way to a precinct with a toddler. Part of the investigation requires me to talk to the toddler. The victim said the toddler was present for everything. I'm a child forensic interviewer as well. During the interview, the toddler recalls their father becoming angry and hitting the mom. Then, the toddler said that the nice woman showed up, and she couldn't see past the nice woman. The nice woman held her and told her that they were both going to be safe and sang her a song in a different language. The toddler said the nice woman went over to the front door and knocked on the door. Then, the nice woman helps them and their mom to the car before flying away. In the victim's interview, she said that her ex-boyfriend had a knife to her throat and put it on the skin to cut her throat open, but he got distracted for some reason and then ran out of the apartment. She had no explanation why. The suspect was caught about 8 hours later. He confessed to absolutely everything. When I asked him about the knife to the throat, he said this: "I swear to God I was gonna cut the bitch's throat open. But I thought I heard a knock at the door and thought it was the police. Once I saw it was clear, I ran outside." He is now serving life in prison, and the mom and toddler are safe and doing well. I'd love to know more about the Nice woman. Story 6. This actually happened to a friend of mine who isn't the cop in this story but is actually family. So this happened maybe about 5 years ago. My friend is in his mid-30s. He and his wife had a 7-month-old baby and a 5-year-old son. His wife was a stay-at-home mom, and his dad owned his own business and had a very flexible schedule. He would take his son to school in the morning, pick him up, etc. It's about 11 a.m. they call the cops because they keep hearing a strange sound in the home, sound like feet or something. And though he was sure it was nothing, he wanted to make sure. So, he says the cop arrives, and the first thing the cop says is, "Why isn't your son in school?" My friend is puzzled and says, "Huh." The cop says, "Your boy is sitting outside on your lawn." My friend again looks at the cop strangely, looks at the lawn and says, "Officer, my son is in school. I dropped him off this morning." The officer looks back, sees nothing, and looks puzzled. At that moment, my friend's cell phone rang, and it was his son's school. Apparently, he had had some sort of allergic reaction to some finger paints that had an egg base or something in it, allergic to eggs, and became extremely swollen, his throat swollen, and couldn't breathe, rushed to the hospital. The cops give them an escort to the hospital so they can fly through lights and all. Arrived at the hospital, and the son was doing fine, is stable, got the little shot to help him and everything. The cop waits to see how the family is doing and wants to check on the kid. My friend is appreciative and lets the cop come up, and he says that he had never seen a paler face in his life. And he said the cop looked as if he had seen a ghost, and said, "That's the kid I saw in your yard." My friend told me this. It creeped me the fuck out. I didn't believe it, but the wife co-signed the whole thing. Story 7. I was an EMT for a while. We got a call about someone who was riding their bike at a breakneck speed when they hit a car head first without a helmet. We went over it immediately, despite the fact that it was broad daylight and we were in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday. Nobody even came to check on this poor guy. Seriously, the streets were empty. Usually, a massive crowd gathers around violent accidents like this. So, his skull was pretty much smashed in, and he was unresponsive. It was the worst head injury I'd ever seen. We assessed that he had a major skull fracture and a concussion, and he was bleeding profusely. He was also missing teeth and had a minor road rash, but fortunately he wasn't missing much skin. To give you an idea of how bad it was, this was the kind of injury that most people don't survive. If you did survive, you'd basically be a crippled vegetable. Normally we would have moved him off the road, but when someone has a head-neck injury, that isn't very safe. My partner, who was also training me as I was still kinda new, went to check his pulse while I began to unload our gear. He crouched down, felt for a pulse for a while, and then stood up and opened his mouth to say something. Suddenly the guy fucking jumped up. He didn't use his arms to pick himself up, he just fucking jumped to his feet. It startled the two of us. He looked at us, smiled, and attempted to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we didn't exactly want to wrestle him to the ground given his condition. He gets away from us and bolts into the woods without his bike. My partner was in even more disbelief than I was. He just stared at where the man had run off, mouth agape. Then he turned to me and muttered, "He had no fucking pulse, man." I asked him if he was sure, and he swore up and down that the biker was clinically dead. We contacted the authorities for assistance, and they sent a search and rescue team into the forest. I don't know if he was found or not, because we normally don't get much information about patients after they go to the professionals. Keep in mind that this was the Pine Barrens, so they had a lot of ground to cover. My best guess is that he went to a loved one's house out of confusion. What I found odd about that is, head injuries bleed like fucking hell, so you'd think the guy would leave a long red trail of blood for the cops to follow. Story 8. Before my dad became a state police officer, he did some security work at a big factory. He's not normally a superstitious person, so when he told me this story with such a weird seriousness to it, it kind of scared the shit out of me. He's always said, "I don't mess with that stuff regarding supernatural things," but anyway. This story's in the early 80s. While working at the factory, he always had the night shift. It was just him and the big-ass factory. He had his own little room where he could watch TV, listen to the radio, and do whatever, but the rest of the factory, for the most part besides the exits, was dark. His job was to actually patrol the factory every hour. He'd get up, grab his flashlight, and just stroll around the place, going down row by row, peeking his head out left to right. One night he set out to do his usual run with flashlight in hand, but he could see that something was unusual to his eye when he walked out into the dark. You know that sensation you get when your eyes adjust to the room and you can just start to make out certain objects but nothing full or whole? There was something darker in the main hall or row, and it was moving. He paused for a minute, and as his eyes fully adjusted, there seemed to be nothing. He took a second to swipe the factory with his light, and then decided that he was just seeing things. He went down into the main row and started his run. Everything was normal, nothing out of the ordinary, although he was still a bit on edge, seeing as the factory without a big moving shadow was creepy enough. When the rows of the factory ended, there was a big open area at the end. This was the entrance to the factory. Normally there would be a light at the front door, but tonight it had dimmed lower. He thought that was weird and really began to sweat, so instead of investigating any further, he turned from the exit and went to go back into the main row and get back up to his room. That's when, in the corner of his eye, on the right side, he could see what he described as a black cloaked figure. His light hit it and he saw it, tall and distinctly human-like, but he didn't stop. He just went right back to his room, locked the door, and stayed in there until it was light out. He left the factory and called the owner to tell him he wouldn't be returning to the job. I don't blame him.
Story 1. I've been a nurse for over a decade now, working in various hospitals across California. You'd think after all this time, I'd have seen it all, but there are some experiences that stick with you, that make you question everything you thought you knew about life and death. This is one of those stories. It all started about 3 years ago when I was working the night shift in the Med-Surg unit at Pinewood Memorial Hospital. It was a quiet night, as most of them were. The kind of night where the only sounds are the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of shoes on linoleum. Around 2 a.m., the call light for room 302 lit up. The patient was an elderly man, Mr. Johnson, who had been admitted for pneumonia. When I entered the room, I found him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something under the bed," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I can hear it moving." I checked under the bed, of course. Nothing there but dust bunnies and a lost slipper. I reassured Mr. Johnson, chalking it up to medication side effects or maybe just the disorientation that often comes with being in the hospital. But he kept insisting. All night long, that call light kept flashing. Each time the same story. Something under the bed, something moving, scratching, whispering. By morning, I was exhausted and more than a little freaked out. The next day, Mr. Johnson was discharged and a new patient was admitted to room 302. Mrs. Rodriguez, a sweet lady in her 70s, there for observation after a fall. I didn't think much of it until my shift that night when her call light started flashing. When I entered the room, Mrs. Rodriguez was sitting up, just like Mr. Johnson had been. Her eyes were fixed on the space beneath her bed. "Nurse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's an animal under the bed. I can hear it scratching." A chill ran down my spine. I checked under the bed again, more thoroughly this time. Nothing. I even got maintenance to come take a look. They found no signs of pests or anything that could be making noise. Mrs. Rodriguez calmed down eventually, but I could tell she was still uneasy. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but a nagging feeling stayed with me for the rest of the shift. The next night, room 302 had a new occupant, Jake, a 23-year-old recovering from appendix surgery. Young, strong, clear-headed, not the type you'd expect to be spooked by imagination or medication. Around midnight, Jake's call light went off. When I got to the room, I found him huddled in the corner, as far from the bed as he could get. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged, "you have to get me out of here. There's something in this room, under the bed. I can hear it, whispering." That was it for me. We moved Jake to another room immediately. I spent the rest of the night poring over the history of room 302, looking for any clues. But there was nothing unusual in the records. Just a standard hospital room with a revolving door of patients. Over the next few weeks, we had 5 more incidents in room 302. Different patients, different ages, different conditions, all with the same story. Something under the bed, scratching, moving, whispering. Management started to take notice. They brought in pest control, had the room deep cleaned, even had a priest come in to bless it, Quietly, of course. Can't have rumors of a haunted hospital room getting out. Nothing changed. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working a double shift, covering for a sick colleague. It was hour 16 of what would be a 24-hour marathon when the call light for 302 lit up again. The patient was a middle-aged woman named Sarah, there for routine tests. As I approached the room, I could hear Sarah's voice. She wasn't calling for help. She was talking to someone, laughing even. I paused outside the door, listening. "Oh, you poor thing," I heard her say. "How long have you been trapped here?" I burst into the room expecting to find another nurse, or maybe a visitor. But Sarah was alone, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking down at the floor. She looked up at me and smiled. "Oh, hello, nurse. I was just talking to the little girl under the bed. She's been so lonely." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What little girl?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "You mean you can't see her? She's right there, under the bed. She says she's been trying to talk to people for so long, but everyone just gets scared and runs away." I don't know what made me do it, but I got down on my knees and looked under the bed. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement, a flash of what might have been a small, pale hand. And then I heard it. A whisper so faint I could barely make it out. "Help me!" I scrambled back, my heart pounding. Sarah was watching me, her eyes wide. "You heard her, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. That night changed everything. I dove into research, digging through old hospital records, city archives, anything I could get my hands on. And slowly a story began to emerge. In the 1950s, when the hospital was first built, there was an accident. A little girl, the daughter of one of the nurses, had been playing hide and seek in the unfinished building. She hid in a small space in what would become room 302, a space that was sealed up during construction. By the time anyone realized she was missing, it was too late. The official story was that she had run away, but the whispers among the older staff told a different tale, of scratching sounds in the walls, of a child's cries echoing through the halls at night. I brought my findings to the hospital administration. At first, they didn't want to hear it, but as the incidents in room 302 continued, they finally agreed to investigate. They opened up the walls of room 302, and there, in a space barely big enough for a child to fit, they found her. A small skeleton clutching a teddy bear, preserved in the dry, sealed space for over 60 years. The hospital held a proper burial. Room 302 was renovated, the walls torn out and rebuilt. And since then, there have been no more reports of strange noises or whispers. But sometimes, late at night when the halls are quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing through the hospital. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe that there are things in this world that we can't explain. Story 2. Growing up in the small village of Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of rural England, I always thought life would be predictable. Quiet farms, local pubs, and the occasional petty crime to keep our lone police constable busy. But the events that unfolded in the summer of 1987 changed everything I thought I knew about our sleepy little corner of the world. I was 17 that year, working part-time at the local pub, the Crooked Hare. It was there that I first heard the whispers about Constable James Hardwick and his unusual experiences. At first, I dismissed them as small-town gossip, the kind of tall tales that grow taller with each retelling. But as the summer wore on and more stories emerged, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it all. It started with what we now call the incident on Foxglove Lane. Hardwick had been called out to a routine disturbance. Nothing more than a noise complaint from old Mrs. Pemberton about her neighbor's dog. He should have been back within the hour. But when he didn't return, and the station couldn't raise him on the radio, people started to worry. I remember that night clearly. The pub was buzzing with speculation. Where was Hardwick? Had there been an accident? It wasn't like him to disappear without a word. As the hours ticked by, the theories grew wilder. It wasn't until nearly midnight that we heard the roar of his patrol car coming down the high street. Hardwick stumbled into the pub looking like he'd seen a ghost. His uniform was disheveled, his eyes wide and unfocused. He made his way to the bar, ordered a double whiskey, and downed it in one gulp. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to tell his story. He'd been driving back from Mrs. Pemberton's when he saw the lights. Not car lights, he insisted, but something different. Brilliant, pulsating orbs hovering just above the road. He'd stopped to investigate, thinking perhaps it was some kind of prank. The last thing he remembered was stepping out of his car. The next thing he knew, he was back behind the wheel, the car facing the opposite direction, and nearly 3 hours had passed. We might have dismissed it as a joke, or maybe too much of the cooking sherry at Mrs. Pemberton's, if it weren't for two things. First, the strange iridescent residue found on Hardwick's uniform. The lab boys in the city couldn't identify it, said it didn't match any known substance. And second, the confirmation from the station that Hardwick's radio had gone completely silent for those missing hours. Not just out of range, but as if it had ceased to exist entirely. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, Hardwick seemed to become a magnet for the inexplicable. The strangest of these incidents happened about a month after the Foxglove Lane event. It was a typically dreary English summer night, rain coming down in sheets, when Farmer Giles called in a panic. His entire herd of cattle, some 30 head, had vanished without a trace. Hardwick and a couple of officers from the next town over responded to the call. I heard about it the next day from my mate Tommy, whose dad was one of the responding officers. According to Tommy, they arrived to find Giles in a right state, babbling about lights in the sky in a sound like the world's biggest vacuum cleaner. The gate to the field was still locked, and there wasn't a single hoof print in the muddy field. The officers split up to search the surrounding area. Hardwick took the road that loops around the back of Giles' property. What happened next? Well, that's where things get truly strange. Hardwick reported that he kept trying to drive the loop, but no matter how many times he went around, he always ended up back at the start of Giles' driveway. It was as if the road itself was playing tricks on him. This went on for hours, until suddenly, just as dawn was breaking, he found himself able to complete the circuit. When he got back to Giles' farm, he found the other officers in a state of confusion. The cows were back, all of them, standing in the field as if they'd never left. But here's the kicker. Despite the continuing rain and the mud-soaked field, the cows were completely dry, and there wasn't a single new hoof print to be seen. Giles swore up and down he hadn't seen or heard them return. The other officers confirmed that they'd driven past the field multiple times during the night, and it had been empty each time. It was as if the entire herd had simply materialized out of thin air. These incidents put Millbrook on the map, in a manner of speaking. We had journalists from the big papers coming down, ghost hunters, UFO enthusiasts, the works. Most of us tried to go about our lives as normal, but there was an undercurrent of unease that never quite went away. Every unexplained light in the sky, every odd noise in the night, set tongues wagging. But it was the case of Dmitry Volkov that really cemented Hardwick's reputation as a magnet for the paranormal. Volkov was a farmhand who'd come over from Eastern Europe to work the harvest season. Quiet bloke, kept to himself mostly. One day in late August, he simply vanished. One minute he was working in the fields, the next, gone. Search parties combed the area for days, but there wasn't a trace of him to be found. A week after his disappearance, Hardwick got a call from a coal yard in a town some 30 miles away. A body had been found. When Hardwick arrived, he found a scene that defied explanation. Volkov's body was at the top of a massive pile of coal. And I mean the very top. A place that would have been nearly impossible for someone to climb, let alone carry a body. But there he was, laid out as if he was sleeping. The coroner's report read like something out of a science fiction novel. Volkov's clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing when he disappeared, but they showed signs of having been removed and then put back on. His body was covered in strange burns, and there was that same unidentifiable residue they'd found on Hardwick after the Foxglove Lane incident. But the real kicker? According to the coroner, Volkov had been dead for less than an hour when he was found. No rigor mortis, no decomposition, as if he'd somehow been preserved. For the week he was missing, only to die shortly before being dumped on that coal heap. The official explanation was a freak accident involving ball lightning. But that didn't account for the missing week, the strange substance on his body, or how he ended up atop that coal pile. And it certainly didn't explain why no one had seen him on the single road between Millbrook and the coal yard. Hardwick was never the same after that. He became withdrawn, jumpy. He'd flinch at sudden noises, and his eyes were always darting around, as if he was expecting something to leap out at him from the shadows. He took early retirement the following year and moved away. Last I heard, he was living somewhere up north, as far from Millbrook as he could get. Story 3. As a Marine Corps military police officer stationed at the Futenma Air Station, I thought I'd seen it all. Bar fights, smuggling attempts, the occasional overzealous tourist, it was all part of the job. But nothing in my training had prepared me for what I would witness during my tour in Japan from 2010 to 2012. It all started on a seemingly ordinary night in late 2010. I was on patrol with my partner, Mike Donnelly, a no-nonsense Boston native with a dry wit that helped the long nights pass more quickly. We were cruising along the perimeter of the air station, the rhythmic hum of our squad car's engine occasionally broken by bursts of chatter from the radio. It was around 0230 hours when the radio crackled to life with an unusual message. Any units seeing the light over the water south? Mike and I exchanged glances. We both knew there were no scheduled flights that night, and the southern tip of the island, where our station was located, wasn't exactly a hotbed of nocturnal activity. "Want to check it out?" Mike asked, already reaching for the radio to respond. I nodded, a mix of curiosity and apprehension building in my gut. "Yeah, let's do it." We weren't the only ones intrigued by the call. As we pulled up to the airfield, I saw 2 other patrol cars already parked, their occupants standing outside, eyes fixed on the horizon. And then I saw it. Hovering over the inky blackness of the Pacific was a light, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, as if it were breathing. The light was too steady to be a star, too large and low to be a satellite. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of multiple tours and not a man easily rattled, shook his head slowly. "I've got no idea, Reeves, but I don't like it." We stood there, a group of trained Marines rendered speechless by a glowing orb in the sky. Someone suggested it might be a star, but deep down, we all knew better. "Hey, dispatch," Rodriguez called into his radio. "Can you get traffic control to zoom in on this thing with their cameras?" A few tense minutes passed before the reply came. "Affirmative. Traffic control has a visual. They're saying the object appears to be moving slowly, heading southeast." A collective shiver ran through our group. To the naked eye, the light appeared stationary, but the high-powered cameras told a different story. Whatever this thing was, it was on the move. For the next hour, we watched in silent awe as the light continued its slow dance across the sky. Theories were tossed around, everything from experimental aircraft to elaborate pranks, but none of them felt right. There was something about the way it moved, the way it seemed to pulse with an inner life, that defied conventional explanation. As dawn began to break, casting the first hints of pink and orange across the horizon, the light faded away as if it had never been there at all. We returned to our patrols, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had witnessed. I thought that would be the end of it, a strange but isolated incident to be filed away and eventually forgotten. I was wrong. Over the next few months, reports of similar lights began to trickle in. Most were easily explained away. Satellites, weather balloons, the occasional drone. But a few stood out, matching the description of what we had seen that night. Then came March 11th, 2011, a date etched into the memory of everyone who was in Japan at the time. The Great East Japan earthquake struck, triggering a devastating tsunami and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. In the chaos and tragedy that followed, thoughts of mysterious lights were pushed to the back of my mind. But as the weeks passed and a semblance of normalcy returned to our corner of Japan, something strange began to happen. The sightings increased. It was about a month after the earthquake when I had my second encounter. I was on a solo run along the seawall, a route I'd taken countless times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As I paused to catch my breath, leaning against the weathered concrete of the wall, I saw it. A light, similar to the one we'd seen months before, darted across the sky. It moved with impossible speed and agility, weaving in and out of the clouds before disappearing in the blink of an eye. My heart raced, and not from the exertion of the run. This time, I knew it wasn't a figment of my imagination. This was real, and it was happening again. Over the next year, the sightings became a topic of hushed conversation among the Marines on base. Some spoke of lights diving into the ocean, others of strange formations moving in perfect synchronization across the night sky. Each story was met with a mix of skepticism and wonder, but as the reports mounted, it became harder to dismiss them as mere coincidence or misidentification. One night, about 6 months before the end of my tour, I was on patrol with a rookie named Thompson. We were parked on a bluff overlooking the ocean, taking a brief respite from the monotony of our rounds. "Hey, Reeves," Thompson said, his voice unusually hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Have you ever seen anything weird out here, like in the sky?" I considered my answer carefully. Despite the increasing frequency of the sightings, there was still an unspoken rule about discussing them openly. Career military men didn't go around spreading stories about UFOs, not if they wanted to be taken seriously. But looking at Thompson's earnest face, I decided to take a chance. "Yeah, Thompson, I have." What followed was a conversation that lasted well into the night. Thompson had seen something the week before, a formation of lights that moved in ways that defied the laws of physics as we understood them. As he spoke, I could see the relief in his eyes at finally being able to share his experience with someone who wouldn't dismiss it outright. As our discussion wound down, Thompson asked the question that had been nagging at all of us who had witnessed these phenomena. "What do you think they are, Reeves?" I sighed, looking out over the dark expanse of the Pacific. "Honestly, I don't know, but I think they're trying to tell us something." "Like what?" "That we're not alone. That there's more out there than we can possibly imagine, and maybe that we need to start paying attention." The remainder of my tour passed without further incident, at least for me personally, but the stories continued to circulate, each one adding to the growing legend of the Okinawa lights. As I prepared to leave Japan in 2012, I took one last run along the seawall. The sun was setting, just as it had been on that day over a year ago, when I'd seen the light darting through the clouds. I half expected, half hoped, to see something, one last confirmation of the extraordinary events I'd witnessed. But the sky remained stubbornly ordinary, painted in the familiar hues of an Okinawan sunset. As I stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear below the horizon, I realized that maybe this was the final message. The lights, whatever they were, had shown us a glimpse of something beyond our understanding. They had challenged our perceptions, sparked our imaginations, and perhaps most importantly, reminded us of how much we still have to learn about the universe around us. I left Okinawa with more questions than answers, but also with a profound sense of wonder. In the years since, I've often found myself looking up at the night sky, searching for a hint of that pulsing light I first saw on that fateful night in 2010. I haven't seen it again, but I know it's out there, somewhere beyond the veil of our limited perception, and I know that someday, somehow, we'll understand what it was trying to tell us. Until then, the mystery of the Okinawa lights remains, a reminder that in this vast universe, there are still echoes of light waiting to be discovered. Story 4. I've been working as a night security guard at the Oak Ridge Apartments for about 2 years now. It's usually a pretty quiet gig, mostly just making sure nobody's throwing wild parties or messing with the amenities after hours. But there's one night I can't shake from my memory, no matter how hard I try. It was a chilly October night, maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I was doing my usual rounds, which always ended with a check of the rooftop pool area. Management's really strict about that pool. It's supposed to be closed and locked up tight after 10 p.m., no exceptions. Anyway, I was heading up the stairwell to the roof around 2 a.m. It was cold as hell that night, so I was taking my time, trying to stay warm in the stairwell before I had to step out into the wind. That's when I heard it. Laughter. At first, I didn't think much of it. People in the building throw parties all the time, and sound carries weird at night. But as I listened, the laughter got louder and louder. It wasn't just a chuckle or a giggle. This was full-on, gasping for air cackling. The kind of laughter that makes you wonder if the person doing it is okay. I paused on the stairs trying to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound close enough to be the pool, but it was definitely coming from above me. As I stood there listening, the laughter suddenly cut off and was replaced by shrieking. Now, I've heard all kinds of noises in this job. Arguments, parties, you name it. But this shrieking, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't scared shrieking or angry shrieking. It was just inhuman. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the roof. The shrieking stopped as soon as I stepped outside. The rooftop was pitch black. The lights around the pool were off, and clouds were covering the moon. I pulled out my flashlight and started sweeping it around, trying to spot whoever was making the noise. That's when I noticed something weird. There were footprints on the roof. Bare footprints, like someone had been walking around up here with no shoes on. But here's the thing. These footprints were dirtier than the roof itself. It was like someone had stepped in mud and then walked across the clean rooftop. I followed the prints with my flashlight. They were strange. No heel marks, just the ball and toes of the foot. Like whoever made them had been tiptoeing around. The prints led right up to the edge of the roof, then just stopped. I want to be clear here. The roof of this building is only accessible through the stairwell I came up. The door is always locked, and I had the only key. To get up here any other way, you'd have to scale a 12-foot concrete wall, in the dark, in the cold. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard the laughter again. This time it was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just more of those weird footprints leading back towards the pool area. I followed them, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight. The prints led right up to the pool's edge and then vanished. I swept my light across the water, half expecting to see a body floating there. But the pool was empty and still, like a sheet of black glass in the darkness. That's when I saw it. A ripple in the water, right in the center of the pool. Just one ripple, spreading out in a perfect circle, like something had just dropped into the water. I don't mind admitting I ran. I bolted back to the stairwell and didn't stop until I was back in the security office, door locked behind me. I spent the rest of my shift watching the security cameras, but they didn't show a thing. No one on the roof, no one in the pool. Just empty darkness. When morning came, I went back up to check. The footprints were gone. The pool was undisturbed. If I hadn't taken a picture of those footprints with my phone, I might have convinced myself I imagined the whole thing. I've been back up to that roof every night since then, but I've never seen or heard anything like that again. Sometimes on really quiet nights, I think I can hear faint laughter on the wind, but I tell myself it's just my imagination. The thing is, I looked into the history of this building after that night. Turns out about 10 years ago, before the building was renovated, a young woman fell from the roof. The official report said it was an accident. She'd been drinking, lost her balance. But there were rumors that she'd been pushed or that she jumped. They say she was a dancer, that she loved to dance in high places. Some of the longtime residents swear they've seen her sometimes, dancing on the edge of the roof in the moonlight. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. I don't know if what I saw that night was a spirit or a prankster or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I do know one thing. Every time I go up to that roof now, I make sure to announce myself. I've thought about quitting this job, finding somewhere else to work, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's a sense of duty, or maybe, just maybe, it's the hope that one day I'll solve the mystery of the midnight dancer on the roof. Story 5. I used to work as security guard at Millbrook Flats. It's an old apartment building that used to be a poorhouse back in the 1800s. It all started in late October. We began getting calls about fire alarms going off in the middle of the night. At first, we thought it was just faulty wiring or maybe some pranksters. But then it kept happening, night after night, always between 2 and 4 a.m. The weirdest part? Every time we'd show up, the residents would be huddled outside, refusing to go back in. They'd tell us they could hear a woman crying inside. Some of them thought it was a homeless person who'd snuck in. Others said it was a crazy tenant, but no one ever found anyone. After about a week of this, my partner Jake and I decided to do a thorough sweep of the building. We arrived around 2:30 a.m., right after another alarm. The residents were all outside looking scared and annoyed. One old lady grabbed my arm as we walked past. "Be careful in there," she whispered. "It's not natural what's happening." Jake just rolled his eyes, but I felt a chill run down my spine. We entered the lobby, and immediately I could hear it, a faint sobbing sound echoing through the stairwell. Jake heard it too. We looked at each other, then started climbing. The crying got louder as we went up. By the third floor, it sounded like it was coming from just around the corner. My heart was pounding. I was sure we were about to find some poor woman huddled on the stairs. We turned the corner, and nothing. The stairwell was empty, but the crying didn't stop. It was loud now, almost deafening, and it seemed to be coming from behind us. We spun around, and I swear the sound was coming from the top step of the stairs we'd just climbed, but there was no one there, just empty space. I don't mind admitting I nearly pissed myself right then and there. Jake's face had gone white. We stood there for a good minute, just staring at that empty step while the crying echoed around us. Finally, Jake snapped out of it. "Let's get the hell out of here," he said. I didn't need telling twice. We practically ran down the stairs and out of the building. Outside, the residents were waiting. "Did you find her?" someone asked. We just shook our heads and got in our car. I thought that would be the end of it. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination or something. But it kept happening. Every few nights, the alarms would go off, and we'd get called out. Sometimes we'd hear the crying, sometimes we wouldn't. But it was always the same story from the residents, a woman sobbing in the stairwell. About a month after it started, I was working a night shift alone. Jake had called in sick. Around 3 a.m., I got the call about Millbrook Flats again. I didn't want to go in alone, but it was my job. The residents were outside as usual. I took a deep breath and went in. The building was dead quiet at first. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. When I reached the third-floor landing, I heard it, that same soft crying. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. The crying got louder as I climbed. When I reached the fourth floor, it sounded like it was right next to me. I turned, expecting to see nothing like before, but this time there was something there. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden in her hands as she sobbed. I opened my mouth to say something, but no sound came out. Slowly, the figure lowered her hands. Her face, God, I'll never forget it. It was pale as death, with hollow black eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. I don't remember running out of the building. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving home as fast as I could. I quit my job the next day. Story 1. As a police officer for over 15 years, I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that cold November night in 2018. I was working the graveyard shift, patrolling a quiet suburban area known for its historic homes and tree-lined streets. Around 2 a.m., I received a call about a possible break-in at an old Victorian house on Maple Street. The caller, an elderly neighbor, reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual noises coming from the supposedly vacant property. As I pulled up to the address, everything seemed eerily still. I approached the house cautiously, flashlight in one hand and my other resting on my holstered weapon. The front door was slightly ajar, which immediately raised my suspicions. I announced my presence and entered the home, my senses on high alert. The interior was dusty and filled with antique furniture draped in white sheets. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed the temperature dropping significantly. My breath began to fog in front of me, despite it being a mild night outside. Suddenly, I heard a creaking sound coming from upstairs. I slowly ascended the staircase, each step causing the old wood to groan beneath my feet. As I reached the second floor, I saw a faint, bluish light emanating from one of the bedrooms. I entered the room, and what I saw next still haunts me to this day. In the corner stood a translucent figure of a woman in Victorian-era clothing. She was facing the window, her form shimmering and flickering like a hologram. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The figure slowly turned towards me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and longing wash over me. Her eyes, though not quite solid, seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't move or speak. It was as if time itself had stopped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the figure began to fade away. As it disappeared, I felt a rush of cold air pass through me, leaving me shaken and disoriented. I quickly searched the rest of the house but found no signs of a break-in or any living intruders. As I left the property, I noticed the elderly neighbor who had made the call watching from her window. She gave me a knowing look, as if she understood exactly what I had experienced. Back at the station, I struggled with how to write up my report. I knew that what I had seen defied logical explanation, but I also knew that including such details would likely damage my credibility. In the end, I simply reported that I had investigated the call and found no evidence of criminal activity. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that old Victorian house. I've researched its history and discovered that a young woman had died there in the late 1800s under mysterious circumstances. While I've always considered myself a rational person, this experience has forced me to question my beliefs about the nature of reality and what might exist beyond our understanding. As a police officer, I'm trained to deal with the tangible and explainable. But that night on Maple Street reminded me that there are some things in this world that defy conventional explanation, leaving us to grapple with the unknown. Story 2. I've been a state trooper for 21 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the lonely highways at night. But nothing compares to what happened to me last summer on a desolate stretch of Route 66. It was around 2 a.m., and I was on my usual night patrol. The road was empty, just miles of darkness, broken only by my headlights. That's when I saw it, a car on the shoulder with its hazards blinking. As I pulled up behind it, I noticed it was an old model, maybe from the 60s or 70s. I approached the driver's side, flashlight in hand, and tapped on the window. The man inside looked disoriented, his clothes outdated. When he rolled down the window, I caught a whiff of something odd, a musty, almost moldy smell. "Everything all right, sir?" I asked. He looked at me with glassy eyes. "Officer, I think I'm lost. What year is it?" I thought he might be drunk or on something, so I asked him to step out of the vehicle. As he did, I noticed his license plate. It was from 1973. That's when things got weird. He started talking about how he was on his way to see his girlfriend, mentioning places and things that hadn't existed for decades. I ran his license through the system, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. The man had been reported missing in 1973, last seen driving on this very highway. I turned back to question him further, but he was gone. The car was gone too. There was no trace of them ever being there. I searched the area for hours, called for backup, but found nothing. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a ghost? A glitch in time? I don't know. But I do know that every time I pass that stretch of highway, I get an uneasy feeling, like I'm being watched by something I can't see. I've never told this story officially. Who would believe me? But it's changed the way I view my job and the world. There are things out there we can't explain, and sometimes as a cop, you become the unwilling witness to them. Story 3. As a 911 dispatcher, I'm used to dealing with all sorts of emergencies. But one call I received about a year ago still haunts me, and not for the reasons you might think. It was a quiet night shift, around 3 a.m. The call came in from a landline, which is becoming increasingly rare these days. The voice on the other end was that of an elderly woman, sounding distressed. "911, what's your emergency?" I asked. "Please, you have to help me," she said, her voice shaking. "There's someone in my house." I immediately dispatched officers to the address while trying to keep her calm and gather more information. "Can you tell me where in the house you are, ma'am?" I asked. "I'm in the bedroom closet," she whispered. "Oh God, I can hear them coming up the stairs." I could hear the fear in her voice, and my heart was racing. I assured her that help was on the way and to stay as quiet as possible. Suddenly she gasped. "They're in the room," she whispered, barely audible. Then the line went dead. I tried calling back, but there was no answer. The officers arrived at the scene within minutes, and I anxiously waited for their report. What they told me next sent chills down my spine. The house was abandoned. It had been for years. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there recently. And here's the kicker. There was no phone line connected to the house. I pulled up the call log thinking maybe I had misheard the address. It was correct, but date was not. We launched an investigation thinking it might be a prank or some kind of system glitch. But as we dug deeper, we uncovered something unsettling. 50 years ago, an elderly woman had been murdered in that very house. She had managed to call the police before she was killed, hiding in her bedroom closet. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it some kind of residual haunting, the echo of a tragic event replaying itself, or something more? I've handled thousands of calls in my career, but this one stays with me. Every time I answer the phone now, there's a part of me that wonders, am I talking to the living or the dead? Story 4. I've been a detective with the Chicago PD for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange cases. But nothing compares to what happened during a routine arrest last winter. We had been tracking a suspect in a series of burglaries for weeks. Finally, we got a tip about his whereabouts and moved in to make the arrest. It was a cold, foggy night, and visibility was poor. My partner and I approached the abandoned warehouse where the suspect was supposedly hiding. As we entered, we could hear footsteps echoing through the empty building. We split up to cover more ground. I saw a figure dart across an upper walkway and gave chase. I followed him up a rusty staircase, my footsteps clanging on the metal. He was just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Finally, I cornered him at the end of a hallway. There was nowhere for him to go, just a solid brick wall and a window too small for a person to fit through. I drew my weapon and ordered him to surrender. That's when things got weird. The suspect turned to face me, and for a split second, I saw a look of terror on his face. Not the usual fear of getting caught, but pure primal terror. Then to my disbelief, he stepped backward, right through the solid brick wall. I stood there stunned. I approached the wall, half expecting it to be some kind of illusion or hidden door. But it was solid brick. There was no way anyone could have gone through it. I called for my partner, and we searched the entire building, but found no trace of the suspect. No hidden passages, no secret exits. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We filed our report, but I left out the part about the suspect walking through a wall. Who would believe that? Instead, we said we lost him in the fog, but I knew what I saw. In the weeks that followed, I dug into the history of that warehouse. Turns out it had been the site of a gruesome murder back in the 1920s. A man had been cornered by rival gangsters and brutally killed, right where I had seen our suspect disappear. I've replayed that night in my mind countless times. Was it some kind of time slip? A ghost? Or had the stress of the job finally gotten to me? I don't have answers, but I do know this. That case changed me. It made me realize that sometimes the line between the explainable and the supernatural isn't as clear as we'd like to think. These days, I approach every case with an open mind, because in this job, you never know when you might encounter something that defies all logical explanation. Story 5. As a park ranger in one of the largest national forests in the Pacific Northwest, I'm used to the eerie silence of the woods at night, but what happened during a search and rescue operation last fall was something entirely different. We got a call about a missing hiker late one evening. A young woman had gone off trail and hadn't returned to her campsite. As night fell, her friends called for help. My team and I set out into the dense forest. It was a moonless night, and the trees seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. We called out for the missing hiker, our voices echoing in the darkness. After hours of searching, we decided to split up to cover more ground. I headed deeper into a part of the forest known for its old-growth trees, some of them centuries old. That's when I started to hear it. Whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the leaves, but as I listened closer, I could make out words. They seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. "She's here," they whispered. "Help her." I called out to my team on the radio, but got only static in response. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I found myself following them, drawn deeper into the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled into a small clearing. There, at the base of a massive old cedar, was our missing hiker. She was unconscious but alive, having fallen and hit her head. As I radioed for medical evacuation, I noticed something strange. The whispers had stopped, but the forest around me felt different, almost alive. The trees seemed to lean in, as if watching over us. When the rescue team arrived, they were baffled as to how I had found her. According to their GPS, I was miles from where I should have been. I tried to explain about the whispers, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. In the days that followed, I returned to that part of the forest many times. I never heard the whispers again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was aware, somehow sentient. I've been a ranger for over 20 years, and I've always felt a connection to nature. But after that night, I see the forest differently. I've come to believe that there are ancient forces at work in these woods, things we can't begin to understand. Some of my colleagues think I'm crazy when I talk about the forest being alive. But those of us who spend our lives in these woods, we know the truth. There's more to this world than what we can see or touch. And sometimes, if we're lucky, nature decides to reveal its secrets to us. These experiences have changed how I approach my job. I'm more attuned to the forest now, more respectful of its mysteries, because I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, there are wonders and terrors beyond our imagination. Story 6, I've been a police officer in a small Midwestern town for nearly 25 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. But what happened to me last winter shook my beliefs to the core. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and I was on patrol in the outskirts of town. A blizzard had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost zero. I was about to call it a night when I saw a faint light in the distance. As I approached, I realized it was a building I'd never seen before. An old-style police station, complete with a vintage patrol car parked out front. Thinking it might be some kind of historical reenactment site, I decided to check it out. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like I'd walked into another era. The decor, the equipment, even the smell, and everything screamed 1950s. A few officers in period-correct uniforms milled about, barely giving me a second glance. I approached the desk sergeant, an older man with a gruff demeanor. "Excuse me," I said, "but what is this place?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "This is the 5th precinct, officer. Are you new here?" Before I could respond, a call came in over their radio. A robbery in progress at the old mill. The sergeant dispatched 2 officers, then turned to me. "You too, rookie. Go with them." In a daze, I followed the other officers out. We piled into the vintage patrol car, which to my surprise started up without a hitch. As we drove through the blizzard, I noticed the town looked different. Older buildings, vintage cars on the streets. We arrived at the mill, which in my time had been abandoned for decades but now appeared fully operational. The next few minutes were a blur of action. We apprehended the suspects, secured the scene, all using equipment that belonged in a museum. As we headed back to the station, I felt a sudden jolt, like the car had hit a pothole. When I looked up, everything had changed. We were back in the present day, the blizzard had cleared, and I was alone in my modern patrol car. I immediately drove back to where I'd seen the old police station, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. Back at my real precinct, I dug into the archives. What I found chilled me to the bone. In 1957, there had indeed been a 5th precinct in our town. It, along with several officers, had been lost in a massive blizzard. The building was never found, and the case remained one of the town's greatest mysteries. Somehow, I had slipped through time, witnessing a night from over 60 years ago. I've never told anyone at the department about this. Who would believe me? But it's changed how I view my job and the world around me. Now, every time I patrol on a snowy night, I keep an eye out for that phantom precinct. Part of me hopes to see it again, to unravel its mysteries, but another part dreads the possibility, fearing what other secrets the past might hold. This experience has taught me that as law enforcement officers, we don't just protect and serve the present. Sometimes we're called upon to bear witness to the echoes of the past, to stories that would otherwise be lost to time. Story 7. I've been on the force for 15 years and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in the old Millbrook district. It was a routine patrol just after midnight. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional stray cat or rustling of leaves. I'd stopped to grab a coffee at the 24-hour diner on 5th when the call came in. Dispatch reported a disturbance at the abandoned Millbrook Elementary School. Probably just some kids messing around, I thought. As I pulled up to the school, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I radioed in my arrival and stepped out of the cruiser, flashlight in hand. The front doors were chained shut, but I noticed a side entrance slightly ajar. As I approached, I heard what sounded like children's laughter echoing from inside. My hand instinctively went to my holster as I called out, "Police! Anyone in there?" The laughter stopped abruptly. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and abandoned desks covered in a thick layer of dust. I made my way down the main hallway, checking each classroom. Nothing seemed out of place, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. As I turned a corner, I froze. At the end of the hall, I saw a small figure dart into a classroom. "Hey, stop right there!" I shouted, breaking into a run. I burst into the room, ready to apprehend whoever it was, but it was empty. Confused, I did a quick sweep of the area. That's when I noticed the chalkboard. Written in fresh chalk were the words, "We've been waiting for you, officer." My blood ran cold. I knew for a fact that board had been blank when I first glanced into the room. I keyed my radio, calling for backup, but all I got was static. Suddenly, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in front of me. The doors to the classroom slammed shut, and I heard the sound of children giggling all around me. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I was trapped in that room. Invisible hands tugged at my uniform, and whispers filled my ears. When the door finally swung open on its own, I bolted. I ran out of that school faster than I've ever run in my life. When I got to my cruiser, I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never filed an official report. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that night, and I've never set foot in that school again. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Millbrook Elementary, but I know one thing for certain: some places are better left undisturbed. Story 8. It was supposed to be a simple welfare check. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly old widow, hadn't been seen by her neighbors for days. I'd been to her house before. She often called us about suspicious noises that always turned out to be raccoons or the wind, but this time felt different. As I pulled up to the Victorian-style home, I noticed all the curtains were drawn. Unusual for Mrs. Henderson, who loved to watch the world go by from her front window. I knocked on the door, announcing myself. No answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, a wave of cold air hit me. It was the middle of July, but I could see my breath. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, my hand instinctively moving to my holster. The house was silent, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. As I moved further in, I noticed something odd. All the pictures on the walls were turned to face the wall, every single one. I made my way upstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. Mrs. Henderson's bedroom door was closed. I knocked gently before pushing it open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the mirror above the dresser, I saw a figure standing behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was normal. Just me, standing alone in the room. I shook my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Lack of sleep, I told myself. It had to be. I continued searching the house, but there was no sign of Mrs. Henderson. As I headed back downstairs, I heard a faint whisper. "Help me!" It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. I called out again, but received no response. In the kitchen, I found Mrs. Henderson's medication on the counter, untouched for days. That's when I noticed the cellar door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I drew my weapon and slowly descended the stairs. The cellar was pitch black, and my flashlight seemed dimmer than usual. As I reached the bottom, I heard a soft sobbing coming from the far corner. I swung my light in that direction and nearly dropped it in shock. There, huddled in the corner, was Mrs. Henderson. But she looked different. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were milky white. She reached out to me, her hand passing through my arm as if it wasn't there. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. As I scrambled up the stairs, I heard Mrs. Henderson's voice one last time. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't know how else to get help." I burst out of the house, gasping for air. My radio crackled to life, dispatch asking for an update. With shaking hands, I reported finding Mrs. Henderson deceased in the cellar. When the coroner arrived, they estimated she had been dead for at least a week. I never told anyone what I really saw that day. How could I explain that I had a conversation with a woman who had been dead for days? But I know what happened in that house, and it's changed how I view the world forever. Sometimes, late at night on patrol, I still hear that whisper, "Help me." And I wonder how many other souls out there are crying out, hoping someone will listen. Story 1. It was a quiet Tuesday night on patrol, the kind of night where you start to wonder if everyone in town decided to behave themselves for once. I'd been cruising the empty streets for hours, only the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep me company. Around 2 a.m., I was heading down a long stretch of country road on the outskirts of town when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. The car behind me was moving erratically, swerving between lanes. Textbook drunk driver. I slowed down, letting them catch up, then hit the lights and pulled them over. As I approached the vehicle, an old blue sedan, I noticed the windows were so heavily tinted I couldn't make out the driver. I tapped on the glass with my flashlight. "License and registration, please." The window rolled down, revealing nothing. The car was completely empty. I stepped back, heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? I circled the vehicle, checking for any sign of the driver, but found nothing. The engine was still running, radio playing softly. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. While waiting, I ran the plates. They came back registered to a John Doe who'd been dead for 15 years. My partner arrived about 10 minutes later. As soon as he pulled up, the blue sedan's engine revved loudly. Before either of us could react, it peeled out, tires squealing as it sped off into the night. We gave chase, but somehow that old beater was faster than our cruiser. We lost sight of it after a few miles and had to give up the pursuit. Back at the station, we filed our report. My partner was convinced it was just some kids playing a prank with a remote-controlled car. But I knew what I saw or didn't see. That car was empty, and no RC vehicle could move like that. A few days later, I was looking through some old case files when I came across a fatal accident report from 15 years ago. A man named John Doe had run his blue sedan off that same stretch of road, dying on impact. The photos showed a car identical to the one I'd pulled over. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I'd had an encounter with something beyond explanation that night. Since then, I've heard whispers from other officers about similar experiences on that road. A phantom car that appears on quiet nights, luring officers into an impossible traffic stop before vanishing into thin air. Some say it's the ghost of John Doe, endlessly reliving his final drive. Others think it's something darker, feeding off the fear and confusion it creates. All I know is that I avoid that stretch of road on the night shift now. And whenever I see a blue sedan in my rearview mirror, my blood runs cold. Because for a brief moment, I'm back there on that lonely road, staring into an empty car and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I've never told this story officially. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that night was real. And I often wonder, how many other unexplainable things have we encountered on the job, only to dismiss them or bury them deep in our minds? What else is out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and our understanding? Sometimes I think about quitting, finding a nice safe desk job where the strangest thing I might encounter is a paper cut. But then I remember why I became a cop in the first place, to protect and serve. And if there are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that might pose a danger to the people of this town, well, someone's got to be out there, ready to face them. So I keep patrolling, night after night. But now I do it with a new awareness that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. And whenever I pull someone over, there's always that moment of hesitation before they roll down the window. That split second where I wonder, will I be looking into the eyes of a normal citizen, or will I find myself staring into the unknown once again? I don't have any answers, only questions. But I do know this. Being a cop means being ready for anything, even if that anything defies all logic and reason. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely road, late at night and see flashing lights in your rearview mirror, do us both a favor. Pull over quickly, keep your hands visible, and whatever you do, don't vanish into thin air. Story 2. I've been on the force for over 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing quite compares to what happened at the old Thornhill place last autumn. It's the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. It started with a routine call, a noise complaint from 1123 Maple Street. The dispatcher mentioned it was Mrs. Abernathy again, an elderly widow known for her frequent calls about disturbances. Most of us chalked it up to loneliness or maybe the beginnings of dementia. I'd been there a few times before, always finding nothing out of the ordinary, just a frail old woman in a house too big for her, jumping at shadows. This time felt different from the moment I pulled up to the curb. The Victorian-style house loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like empty eyes staring down at me. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the porch, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. Mrs. Abernathy answered the door before I could knock, her thin face pale and drawn. "Officer Jensen," she said, her voice quavering. "Thank goodness you're here. It's gotten worse." I stepped inside, the familiar, musty smell of old books and mothballs filling my nostrils. "What's gotten worse, Mrs. Abernathy?" She wrung her hands, glancing nervously around the dimly lit foyer. "The voices, they're clearer now. And I saw something, a shadow moving on its own." I'd heard this before, but something in her tone made me take it more seriously this time. "Can you show me where?" She led me to the kitchen, a large room with outdated appliances and faded wallpaper. "It was right there," she pointed to a corner near the pantry. "A dark shape, like a person, but not quite." I walked over to investigate, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn back when I felt it, a sudden, intense cold spot. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Mrs. Abernathy, do you feel that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, hugging herself. "It happens sometimes, like someone left a freezer open, but it's just in one spot." I'd dealt with drafts before, but this was different. The cold was concentrated, almost solid. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely there. "I'm going to check the rest of the house," I told Mrs. Abernathy. "Why don't you wait in the living room?" As I moved through the old house, things got stranger. In the upstairs hallway, I distinctly heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. In the master bedroom, I watched in disbelief as a door slowly swung shut on its own. By the time I got back downstairs, I was shaken. I prided myself on being rational, on finding logical explanations for things, but what I'd experienced defied easy answers. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting for me, a sad smile on her face. "You've seen it now, haven't you? I'm not crazy." I sat down heavily in an armchair. "No, Mrs. Abernathy, you're not crazy, but I don't know what to make of this." She sighed, looking suddenly very old and very tired. "It started about 6 months ago. Just little things at first. Items not where I left them. Cold spots. Then the whispers began. I thought I was losing my mind. I took out my notebook, professionalism kicking in despite my unease. Has anything changed recently? Any renovations? New items brought into the house?" She shook her head. "Nothing like that, but..." She hesitated. "I did find something. In the attic." Mrs. Abernathy led me up to the attic, a cluttered space full of dusty furniture and old boxes. She pointed to a trunk in the corner. It was hidden behind some old paintings. I'd never seen it before. Inside the trunk were newspapers from the 1950s, all featuring the same headline: "Double Murder Shocks Quiet Neighborhood." The articles detailed the brutal killing of a young couple in their home, 1123 Maple Street. "I had no idea," Mrs. Abernathy whispered. "We bought the house in the 70s. No one ever mentioned." Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time at the Thornhill house. Off duty, of course. I told myself it was to keep an eye on Mrs. Abernathy. But the truth was, I was fascinated, obsessed even. I dug into the old case files, learning about Thomas and Eleanor Thornhill, newlyweds found dead in their bedroom. The killer was never caught. As I delved deeper, strange things kept happening in the house. Objects would move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers grew louder, though I could never quite make out the words. One night as I was leaving, I saw a shadow figure at the top of the stairs. Just for a moment, but unmistakable. I ran up to investigate, but found nothing. When I came back down, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting. "You can't help them," she said softly. "I've tried. The best we can do is listen." I wanted to argue, to insist there had to be a rational explanation, but I knew deep down that I'd encountered something beyond my understanding, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I still check in on Mrs. Abernathy regularly. The activity in the house seems to have calmed down, but there's always a tension in the air, like the place is holding its breath. Sometimes when it's quiet, I swear I can hear faint whispers carried on the wind. I've never officially reported what happened at the Thornhill house. Who would believe me? But it's changed me, made me realize that there are things out there we can't explain, can't rationalize away. As cops, we're trained to look for logical answers, to follow the evidence. But sometimes the evidence leads us to places we're not prepared to go. Sometimes we have to accept that there are mysteries in this world that go beyond our understanding. I still patrol the streets every night, still respond to calls and write up reports, but now I do it with a new awareness, an openness to possibilities I would have dismissed before, because I know now that reality is stranger and more complex than we can imagine. And sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I find myself driving past 1123 Maple Street. I never stop, never go in, but as I pass, I swear I can hear whispers on the wind, secrets longing to be heard. And I wonder what other mysteries are out there, waiting to be uncovered in the darkness. Story 3. It was just another Tuesday night on patrol in our sleepy Colorado town when the call came in. Dispatch's voice crackled over the radio, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Unit 17, we've got a 1091V at 1542 Aspen Drive. Caller claims there's a ghost in her attic." I sighed, already imagining some bored teenager playing pranks or an overly imaginative retiree. But a call's a call, so I flipped on the lights and headed over. The house was one of those cookie-cutter McMansions that had sprung up like weeds on the outskirts of town. As I pulled up, I saw a woman in her early 40s pacing on the perfectly manicured lawn, wringing her hands. "Ma'am," I called as I approached. "I'm Officer Reeves." "You called about a disturbance?" She whirled to face me, eyes wide. "Oh, thank God you're here. It's been going on for days now. The screaming, the banging. I thought I was losing my mind." I raised an eyebrow. "And you believe this is supernatural in nature?" She nodded vigorously. "What else could it be? I live alone, no pets, and the neighbors are all away for the ski season." I'd heard it all before, but something in her voice made me take it a bit more seriously. "All right, ma'am, I'll take a look. Could you show me to the attic access?" She led me inside, pointing to a trap door in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. "Up there, but I'm not going anywhere near it." I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was a mess of cobwebs and dust, old furniture draped in sheets like pale ghosts. As I swept my light around, I caught a glint of something in the far corner. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the space, followed by a muffled cry. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my hand instinctively going to my weapon. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is the police. Come out where I can see you." Another bang, another cry. It sounded pained. I cautiously made my way toward the source of the noise, pushing aside a stack of old boxes. What I found was the last thing I expected. A man, probably in his 60s, was huddled in the corner. His leg was caught in a hole in the floor, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. "Oh, thank God," he croaked when he saw me. "I thought I was gonna die up here." I helped him free his leg and get to his feet. "Sir, what on earth are you doing up here?" He looked sheepish. "Name's Frank. I, uh, I used to own this place, lost it in the divorce last year, been living on the streets since then. As I helped Frank down the ladder, I pieced together his story. He'd been sneaking into houses in the neighborhood, looking for a warm place to sleep. But in this one, his old home, he'd gotten nostalgic. Went up to the attic to look at some of his old things he'd left behind. That's when he fell and got stuck. The homeowner was shocked to learn the truth. Frank? But I bought this place from a real estate company. They never mentioned... Frank nodded sadly. Yeah, they bought it off me when I couldn't keep up the payments. Guess they didn't want to mention the sad sack previous owner. I should have arrested Frank for trespassing, but something about the whole situation tugged at my heartstrings. Instead, I made a call to a buddy who runs a homeless shelter in town. As we waited for the shelter van to arrive, the homeowner, Susan, I learned, brought Frank some food and water. They got to talking, and I watched as initial fear and resentment melted into something like understanding. You know, Susan said thoughtfully, I've been thinking of hiring a handyman to help with some repairs around the house. The pay wouldn't be much, but... Frank's eyes lit up. Ma'am, I was a contractor for 30 years before things went south. I'd be happy to help out. I left them exchanging contact information, marveling at how the night had turned out. What started as a ridiculous call about a ghost ended up changing 2 lives for the better. As I drove back to the station, I couldn't help but chuckle. In all my years on the force, I'd never encountered a real ghost, but I'd seen plenty of people haunted by their past, their mistakes, their regrets. Sometimes what we need most isn't an exorcism, but a second chance. I still drive by 1542 Aspen Drive sometimes. Frank's got the place looking better than ever, and I often see him and Susan chatting on the porch. It's a good reminder that in this job, you never know what you're going to find when you answer a call. And sometimes the best resolutions come not from enforcing the law, but from a little human kindness. Story 4. In my 15 years on the force, I've seen a lot of strange things, but nothing quite compares to the incident at the Thompson house back in '98. It's the kind of case that sticks with you, that makes you question what you think you know about the world. It was a quiet Saturday night in our small Midwestern town. I was on patrol when a call came in about a possible break-in at 1456 Elm Street. Dispatch said a group of teenagers had reported seeing someone inside the house when the family was supposed to be away. I pulled up to find 4 kids, probably about 16 or 17, standing nervously by their car in the driveway. As I approached, I could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't some prank gone wrong. These kids were genuinely spooked. Evening, folks, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Want to tell me what's going on here? The tallest boy, Jake, stepped forward. Officer, we came to pick up our friend Tommy. We were supposed to go to the movies, but there's someone in his room, and it's not Tommy. I raised an eyebrow. You're sure about that? All 4 nodded vigorously. Another boy, Mike, chimed in. We've been here for like 20 minutes. We keep seeing someone peeking through the blinds in Tommy's room. We thought he was messing with us at first, but it doesn't feel right. I looked up at the house. It was a typical suburban 2-story, all dark except for a faint glow from a nightlight in one of the lower windows. And you're certain the family isn't home? No way, said a girl named Sarah. Tommy's family left for his grandma's birthday thing this afternoon. They're not supposed to be back until tomorrow. Just then, another car pulled into the driveway. A middle-aged couple and a teenage boy got out, looking confused. Officer, the man called out, is everything all right? I quickly pieced together that this must be the Thompson family. I explained the situation, watching as their faces grew increasingly concerned. But that's impossible, Mrs. Thompson said. We've been gone since 3 p.m. The house was empty, and our alarm was set. I turned to the boy who I assumed was Tommy. Son, did you maybe forget something and come back without telling your parents? Tommy shook his head, eyes wide. No, sir. I've been with them the whole time. At this point, protocol dictated that I treat this as a potential break-in. I called for backup and had everyone stay behind me as I approached the house. Mr. Thompson disabled the alarm and let me in. I did a thorough sweep of the house, room by room, floor by floor. Nothing was disturbed. No signs of forced entry. The alarm log showed it hadn't been deactivated since the family left. It was as if no one had been there at all. When I got to Tommy's room, a chill ran down my spine. The blinds were closed just as the kids had described, but there was no one there and no evidence that anyone had been. I rejoined the group outside, shaking my head. The house is clear. There's no one inside and no signs that anyone has been. The four teenagers looked at each other in disbelief. Jake spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "But officer, we all saw it. Someone kept peeking through those blinds. We saw their eyes." I spent the next hour taking statements from everyone. All four kids told the exact same story, down to the number of times they saw the person and the approximate times. They were consistent, coherent, and clearly rattled. In the end, I had no choice but to file it as an unfounded report. There was simply no evidence of any crime or intrusion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the years, I've thought about that night many times. I've run through every possible explanation, tricks of the light, overactive imaginations, some elaborate prank. But none of it quite fits. Those kids saw something that night, something that by all logical accounts couldn't have been there. And yet, four separate witnesses all reported the same inexplicable phenomenon. It's cases like these that remind me that there's still so much we don't understand about our world. As police officers, we're trained to look for rational explanations, to follow the evidence. But sometimes the evidence leads us to places we can't explain. I still drive by the Thompson house sometimes. It looks the same as it always has, just another suburban home on a quiet street. But every time I pass, I find myself glancing up at that second-story window, half expecting to see a pair of eyes peering back at me through the blinds. In this job, we're supposed to protect and serve, to make sense of the chaos and keep our communities safe. But how do you protect people from something you can't see, can't touch, can't even prove exists? I don't have any answers, but I do know this. That night changed the way I look at the world. It taught me that sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones we can't explain. Story 5, I've been with Naval Security Forces for over a decade, but nothing in my training prepared me for what I experienced at Naval Station Argus last year. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. It was a crisp October night, the kind where the fog rolls in thick off the bay, blurring the lines between sea and sky. I was partnered with Officer Martinez, a skeptical veteran of the force who'd seen it all, or so he thought. At 200 hours, the call came in. Another alarm at Building 17, an innocuous-looking office structure that dated back to World War II. As we sped toward the site, Martinez filled me in. "Third time this month," he grumbled. "Always the same. Alarm trips, we show up. Everything's locked tight as a drum. It's getting old." We arrived to find the building dark and silent. Standard procedure. We checked every door, every window, even the roof access. Everything was secure. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of any disturbance. And yet the alarm had definitely been triggered. As we stood puzzling over the situation, a figure emerged from the fog. It was Dr. Elias Kraft, the building's chief researcher, looking disheveled and annoyed. "Not again," he sighed, fumbling with his keys. "I was hoping to get one full night's sleep this week." Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old books and something else. Ozone, maybe? We swept the building methodically, floor by floor. Everything seemed normal until we reached the third floor. The moment we stepped off the elevator, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath fogged in the air. Martinez and I exchanged glances, both of us suddenly on high alert. As we moved down the hallway, I noticed something odd about the photos on the wall. They were all of naval personnel, dating back decades. But in each one, there was a figure that seemed off, blurred, or standing at an impossible angle. We reached Dr. Kraft's office at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but a faint blue light pulsed from beneath it. Dr. Kraft stepped forward to unlock it, his hand visibly shaking. "I should warn you," he said softly. "What's in here? It's classified, and you might not believe what you see." The office beyond was a mess of papers, strange equipment, and glowing screens. But what caught my eye was the large device in the center of the room. It looked like a cross between a radar dish and a Tesla coil, humming with energy. Dr. Kraft cleared his throat. We've been working on a project. Let's call it temporal imaging. The ability to see echoes of past events. Martinez scoffed. What, like time travel? Not exactly, Kraft replied. More like peeking through the curtains of time. But something's gone wrong. We're not just seeing the past anymore. I think we're pulling it through. As if on cue, the device pulsed. The air shimmered, and for a moment I saw the office as it might have looked 70 years ago. A figure in an old naval uniform stood by the window, staring right at me with eyes that knew too much. Then it was gone, leaving only the faint smell of cigarette smoke and sea salt. Dr. Kraft slumped into his chair. It's getting stronger. The incursions are lasting longer. I'm afraid we might be tearing the fabric of reality. Martinez looked like he wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation, but I could see in his eyes that he'd seen it too. This was beyond anything in our training manuals. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. Objects from the past would appear in the building, only to vanish hours later. Staff reported seeing figures in outdated uniforms, hearing snippets of conversations from decades ago. The brass tried to keep it quiet, but rumors spread. They eventually shut down the project, sealed off Building 17 entirely. But sometimes on quiet nights when the fog rolls in thick, I swear I can still hear phantom alarms echoing across the base. I've never filed an official report about what I saw that night. Who would believe it? But it's changed the way I view my job and the world. We're trained to protect against tangible threats. Intruders, spies, terrorists. But how do you secure a facility against the past itself? How do you maintain order when reality itself becomes fluid? I don't have answers, but I do know this. The line between past and present, between possible and impossible, is far thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones that come not from outside our borders, but from outside our very concept of time and space. So the next time you hear an unexplained alarm in the night or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, remember that not all security breaches can be explained by our standard protocols. Some threats transcend time itself, echoing from a past that refuses to stay buried. Story 6, I've been a 911 dispatcher for nearly 2 decades, and in this job you think you've heard it all. But there's one case that still keeps me up at night, one that blurs the line between paranoia and something else. It started about 5 years ago. Every Thursday, like clockwork, we get a call from Mildred Pearson, an elderly woman living on the outskirts of town. The first few times I handled it like any other call. 911, what's your emergency? They're here again, Mildred would whisper, her voice trembling. The men in black suits. They're trying to read my thoughts. Standard procedure for these types of calls is to send an officer for a wellness check. But after the 3rd week, with resources stretched thin, I started talking to Mildred myself. At first, I thought it was just a lonely old woman seeking attention. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice patterns. Mildred always called at exactly 9:17 p.m. She always reported the same symptoms: a high-pitched ringing in her ears, a metallic taste in her mouth, and the sensation of being watched. And every time she insisted that black vehicles were parked just out of sight of her property. I started logging these calls meticulously against protocol. Something about Mildred's consistency, her genuine terror, nagged at me. About 6 months in, things escalated. Mildred called frantic, saying she'd covered her entire house in aluminum foil. It's the only way to block their signals, she insisted. When an officer finally went to check on her, he reported that the place looked like a badly wrapped Christmas present. Mildred had even fashioned herself a foil hat. Most of my colleagues laughed it off. Another crazy old lady, they said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. I started doing my own research off the clock. I looked into government projects involving electromagnetic frequencies, mind control experiments, even UFO sightings in our area. Most of it seemed like conspiracy theory nonsense, but there were enough credible reports to keep me digging. Then about a year into Mildred's calls, something changed. She called on a Tuesday, her voice calmer than I'd ever heard it. They made contact, she said simply. I know what they want now. Before I could ask for clarification, the line went dead, and Mildred never called again. I tried to follow up, even drove by her house once. The foil was gone. The place looked normal. When I knocked, a young couple answered. They just moved in, they said. No, they didn't know anything about the previous owner. It was like Mildred Pearson had simply vanished. I filed a missing persons report, but without any evidence of foul play, it didn't go far. My superiors told me to let it go. Just another lonely old woman who'd probably moved into a care facility. But I couldn't shake it. The consistency of her calls, the sudden change, her disappearance. It all felt wrong. A few months after Mildred's last call, I noticed something strange. Every Thursday at exactly 9:17 p.m., my computer would glitch. Just for a second, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. And in that moment, I swear I could hear a faint, high-pitched ringing. I requested our IT department check it out, but they found nothing. No one else seemed to notice it. Just me. Last week, I was driving home from a late shift when I saw them. 3 black SUVs, parked on the side of the road near where Mildred used to live. As I passed, I felt a sudden metallic taste in my mouth. I haven't told anyone else about this. They'd think I was crazy, that Mildred's paranoia had rubbed off on me. Hell, maybe I am crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that Mildred was right, that there's something out there, something beyond our understanding. I've started lining my bedroom with aluminum foil. My wife thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am. But every Thursday night at 9:17 p.m., I sit by my ham radio, listening, waiting, because I think Mildred was trying to warn us about something. And I have a terrible feeling that one day, probably a Thursday at 9:17 p.m., we're all going to find out what it was. So if you're ever driving through our town on a Thursday night and you see black SUVs parked on the side of the road, don't stop. Don't even slow down. And whatever you do, don't answer if you hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears. Some frequencies are better left unheard. Story 1. I always thought my grandma Ada was a little on the paranoid side, but I could never have imagined what she went through that night back in '78. She lived alone in this little house on the edge of town after Grandpa passed, kept to herself mostly. But one summer evening when I was 12, Mom got a call that Grandma was in the hospital. We rushed over, not knowing what to expect. Grandma was sitting up in bed looking shaken but okay. The cops were there too. Apparently Grandma had called 911 in a panic, saying she saw someone lurking in her backyard. But by the time the police arrived, there was no sign of any intruder outside. The doors were all unlocked though. What the cops did find, and what had Grandma so spooked, were muddy footprints inside the house, coming in from the back door, circling through the living room and kitchen, then going right back out the same way. Someone had been in there with her. Grandma told us she had been sitting in her favorite armchair that faced the big picture window overlooking the backyard, lost in thought as the sun went down. Then something caught her eye outside, a shadowy figure seeming to peer in at her. She froze in fear, too afraid to get up, just fixed on the dark shape looming out there. Finally, she grabbed the phone on the table next to her and dialed 911, quietly pleading for them to hurry. Someone was outside her house. That whole time, she never took her eyes off the window, off the figure that stood there unmoving. It wasn't until the cops arrived that she put together what really happened. The figure hadn't been outside at all. It was a reflection in the glass of someone standing behind her in the darkened living room. Judging from the footprints, he had slipped in the unlocked back door and crept up right behind where Grandma was sitting, spying on the frail old woman as she gazed out unaware. Why he was there and what he wanted, no one knows. Grandma catching sight of his reflection may have scared him off. The police said it looked like he hightailed it out of there. I still get chills picturing it though. How long was he standing there watching, only a few feet behind her in the shadows? What would have happened if she didn't catch a glimpse of him in the window? I guess in a twisted way, Grandma's paranoia saved her that night. Story 2. This is unexplained, and probably just coincidence, but I still never mention it to my coworkers. I spent some time as a homicide investigator. We would respond to all apparent suicides and investigate them just to make sure it wasn't a homicide. Usually we determined a motive for suicide and found a note or other indicator that the person killed themselves. One guy just taped a note to his chest that said, "Happy now, bitch," and made sure his wife found him after he hanged himself. But occasionally you get a case where all forensic evidence indicates that the person killed themselves. But there's no note and no discernible reason why this person would be suicidal. These are people in good health with decent careers and a seemingly happy family life. But who knows what's really going on with someone? Here's the part that freaks me out. I've worked maybe 10 suicides like this. The last 3 before I left homicide all had the same thing at the scene. These was a little decorative wicker lighthouse at each location. It was the same lighthouse, same design, and painted white and blue. It stuck out to me the first time because it was by the bed where the body was. But 2 weeks later, I saw the same damn lighthouse on another suicide and even pointed out the coincidence to a patrol officer. A few months later, I go on another suicide and I see that same wicker lighthouse. That's when it clicks that it's always been unexplained suicides. I go back and look at crime scene photos from every suicide I've worked. In 2 of them, I see what could be the wicker lighthouse, but the angle is off and there's too much junk around to say for sure. I don't know. I thought it was creepy as hell, but I transferred a couple of months later and I let it go. Edit. Well, that got more of a response than I was anticipating. To answer the question of, was it a serial killer, I very much doubt it. These were clearly suicides, most of which had no feasible alternative explanation. We work every suicide as if it were a homicide. An apparent suicide is almost always a suicide, but we err on the side of caution. Also, while serial killers are actually more common than most people think, they rarely leave calling cards or anything like you see in movies. It's usually some fucked up dude that has a particular taste. I really do think it was an odd coincidence, but it was still pretty fucking creepy. Story 3. I've been an EMT for about 5 years now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff. But there's one call that still haunts me to this day. It happened about 2 years ago, and I still can't wrap my head around what I saw. It was a crisp autumn evening, just as the sun was setting. My partner Jake and I got a call about a cyclist who'd been hit by a car in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Pretty routine stuff, or so we thought. When we arrived on the scene, the first thing that struck me was how eerily quiet it was. Usually, with accidents like these, you get a small crowd of onlookers, maybe some people trying to help. But here, nothing. Just empty streets and the fading orange glow of sunset. The cyclist was sprawled out on the road, his bike a mangled wreck a few feet away. As we got closer, my stomach dropped. This was bad, really bad. The guy's head had taken the brunt of the impact, and without a helmet, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. His skull was visibly fractured, blood pooling beneath him. It was the kind of injury you don't walk away from. Jake and I shared a look. We both knew the drill for situations like this. With head and neck injuries this severe, you don't move the patient unless absolutely necessary. So we started setting up our equipment, preparing to stabilize him as best we could before transport. I was grabbing the backboard when Jake went to check for a pulse. Standard procedure, even though we both knew it was probably futile. I watched as he crouched down, fingers pressed against the cyclist's neck. After a moment, he looked up at me, his face pale. "No pulse," he mouthed silently. I nodded grimly. We'd still do everything we could, of course. But at this point, it was looking like we'd be calling the coroner instead of the hospital. And then, I still get chills thinking about it. The cyclist's eyes snapped open, not the glazed, unfocused look of someone regaining consciousness. His eyes were clear, alert, almost unnaturally so. Before either of us could react, he sat up. No, that's not right. He didn't sit up. He sprang up, like a jack-in-the-box. 1 second, he was lying there, still as death. The next, he was on his feet. Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling on his ass. I froze, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. The cyclist stood there for a moment, swaying slightly. Then his gaze focused on us, and he smiled. It wasn't a relieved smile, or a confused one. It was knowing, almost mocking. He took a step towards his mangled bike, and that snapped us out of our shock. Jake reached for him, trying to keep him from moving. "Sir, you've been in a serious accident. You need to lie down, we're here to help." The cyclist dodged Jake's outstretched hand with surprising agility. He turned that unnerving smile on us one more time, then bolted. Now, I'm no slouch. I keep in shape, It's part of the job. But this guy, he took off like an Olympic sprinter. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the woods at the edge of the neighborhood. Jake and I stood there staring at the spot where he'd vanished. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Jake turned to me, his face ashen. He didn't have a pulse, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear to God he didn't have a pulse. We called it in, of course. Reported a critically injured patient who had fled the scene. They sent out search parties, but as far as I know, they never found him. We gave our statements, filled out the paperwork, but there wasn't much else we could do. The thing is, the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. Head injuries bleed like crazy. This guy's skull was literally cracked open. He should have left a trail of blood a mile wide. But when the search parties went through those woods, nothing, not a single drop. And his injuries. I've seen my fair share of severe trauma. That guy shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone run. Hell, by all rights, he shouldn't have been alive at all. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe Jake made a mistake checking for a pulse. Maybe the guy wasn't as badly hurt as we thought, but deep down, I know what I saw, and it just doesn't add up. Story 4, I never believed in ghosts. Not until I started working at Blackstone Correctional. It's an old prison built in the 1800s, with a reputation that'd make your skin crawl. I took the job because the pay was good, and I needed the money. But looking back, I'm not sure any amount of cash was worth what I experienced there. My first week was uneventful. Night shifts in a maximum security prison are tense, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. It wasn't until my second week that things started getting weird. It started with the dogs. We use them for patrols and searches, and they're usually eager to work. But at Blackstone, they'd get to the main gate and just stop. Hackles raised, whining, digging their paws in. No amount of coaxing or commanding could get them to cross that threshold. I'd never seen anything like it. Then there were the noises. At first, I brushed them off as the usual sounds of an old building settling. But they kept getting louder, more distinct. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Doors slamming shut when no one was around. The kind of stuff that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But the night that really got to me, that was about a month into my stint at Blackstone. I was on duty with Mike, an old-timer who'd been working there for decades. We were doing our rounds on C Block, the oldest part of the prison. It was around 2 a.m., that dead time of night when everything feels a little off. We were walking down the main corridor when we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, like someone wearing boots, running full tilt. Mike and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing, escapee. We radioed it in and started moving toward the sound. But something wasn't right. The footsteps were too loud, too clear, like they were right next to us, but we couldn't see anyone. Suddenly, the empty cells around us started slamming shut, one after another, bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed off the stone walls, making it feel like the whole place was shaking. I turned to Mike, ready to ask what the hell was going on, when I saw his face. He was white as a sheet, eyes wide, staring at something above us. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A pair of old-fashioned boots, the kind with metal cleats on the soles, running along the ceiling. Just the boots, nothing else. They clattered along, sparks flying where the metal hit the concrete, moving faster than any person could run. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I was brave. But the truth is, I ran. Bolted right out of there with Mike hot on my heels. We didn't stop until we were outside, gulping in the cool night air like we'd been underwater. When we calmed down enough to talk, Mike told me about the history of C Block. Back in the early days of the prison, there was a guard named Thomas Blackwood. He was known for being particularly cruel to the inmates, always wearing his signature hobnail boots that echoed through the halls. One night during a riot, a group of prisoners cornered Blackwood in C Block. They beat him to death with his own boots. According to Mike, ever since then, people have reported seeing those same boots running through the prison, like Blackwood's spirit is still patrolling the halls. I tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I put in my resignation the next day. Story 5. I've been a detective for 15 years, specializing in sex crimes and crimes against children for the last 5. It's a job that shows you the worst of humanity. But sometimes, just sometimes, it gives you a glimpse of something else. Something I can't explain, even now. It was a Tuesday night in November when the call came in. Midnight, give or take a few minutes. A young woman had walked into the precinct with a toddler in tow, reporting that her ex-boyfriend had raped her during a custody argument. I was on call that night, so I headed in immediately. The woman, let's call her Sarah, was sitting in the interview room when I arrived. Her daughter, barely 3 years old, was asleep on her lap. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, her clothes disheveled, but there was a steely determination in her gaze that I've rarely seen in victims so soon after an assault. I won't go into the details of Sarah's statement. Some things are better left unsaid. But I will say this. It was one of the most brutal cases I've ever handled. The kind that makes you question humanity and leaves you staring at the ceiling at night, wondering how people can do such things to each other. What struck me most, though, was how Sarah had managed to get herself and her daughter to the precinct. The attack had happened at her ex's apartment, miles away. She had no car, no phone, yet here she was, safe, if not sound. "I don't really remember how I got here," Sarah said when I asked. "It's all a blur. I just knew I had to get Emma safe." Emma, that was the daughter's name. And talking to Emma was the next step in our investigation. Now, interviewing children is a delicate process. As a certified child forensic interviewer, I know the importance of letting the child lead the conversation, of not introducing any information they haven't mentioned themselves. It's all about open-ended questions and careful listening. Emma was still groggy when we started talking, but she perked up quickly. Kids are resilient like that. I asked her to tell me about what happened at her dad's house. "Daddy got mad," she said, her little face scrunching up at the memory. "He was yelling at Mommy, then he started hitting her." I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "What happened next, Emma?" "That's when things took a turn I wasn't expecting. The nice lady came," Emma said, her eyes brightening. "She was pretty and glowy." I raised an eyebrow. "Can you tell me more about the nice lady?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "She picked me up and hugged me. She said we were going to be safe, me and Mommy. Then she sang a song, but I didn't know the words." "What language was the song in?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. Emma shrugged. "I don't know. It was pretty, though." I made a note to ask Sarah about this nice lady later. Maybe a neighbor had intervened. But Emma's next words made me pause. "I couldn't see past the nice lady," Emma continued. "She was all glowy and bright. Then she went to the door and knocked. After that, she helped me and Mommy to the car. Then she flew away." I blinked, trying to process this information. Flew away? I'd heard children come up with fantastical stories to cope with trauma before, but this felt different somehow. "Emma," I said carefully, "can you tell me anything else about how you and your mom got to the police station?" But Emma just shook her head. "The nice lady helped us, that's all." I wrapped up the interview shortly after that. Emma had given me plenty to work with, even if some of it was unusual. When I spoke to Sarah again, I asked her about their escape from the apartment. Her brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "It's strange," she said. "One minute he had a knife to my throat. I could feel the blade, the pressure. I thought, I was sure he was going to kill me." She swallowed hard, her hand going to her neck. "Then suddenly he just stopped, looked towards the door like he'd heard something. Next thing I knew, he was running out of the apartment." "Did you see anyone else there?" I asked. Emma mentioned a nice lady. Sarah shook her head. "No, there was no one else there. Just us and him." She paused, looking thoughtful. "But you know, now that you mention it, I do remember feeling, I don't know how to describe it. Safe, protected, like someone was watching over us. Is that crazy?" I assured her it wasn't. In this job, you learn to trust your instincts. And right then, my instincts were telling me there was more to this story than met the eye. We caught the ex-boyfriend about 8 hours later. He was trying to skip town, but didn't get far. When we brought him in for questioning, I wasn't expecting much. These types usually lawyer up pretty quick. But to my surprise, he confessed. To everything, in excruciating detail. It was like he couldn't stop himself, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of guilt and fear. When he got to the part about the knife, I leaned in. You had the knife to her throat, I said. Why didn't you use it? He looked at me then, and I swear, I saw real fear in his eyes. I swear to God I was gonna do it. Cut the bitch's throat open. But then, I heard a knock at the door. Thought it was the cops. When I looked, there was no one there, but I don't know, man. I just had to get out of there. It felt like someone was watching me, judging me. A chill ran down my spine at his words. They echoed Sarah's feelings, Emma's story. But it couldn't be. Could it? The case wrapped up pretty quickly after that. With his confession and the physical evidence, it was open and shut. He's serving life now, no chance of parole. Sarah and Emma are in therapy, healing, moving forward with their lives. But I can't let it go. In quiet moments, I find myself thinking about that night, about Emma's nice lady, about the knock on the door that no one seemed to hear, but everyone felt, about the feeling of safety, of protection, that seemed to envelope Sarah and Emma in their darkest hour. I've been a cop for a long time. I've seen things that defy explanation, sure, but nothing like this, nothing that stuck with me quite like this case. I've tried to rationalize it, of course. Trauma can do strange things to memory. Children often create fantastical narratives to cope with difficult situations. Maybe Sarah had a moment of dissociation, got herself and Emma to safety on autopilot. Maybe the ex's guilt manifested as paranoia, making him think he heard something that wasn't there. But then I think about Emma's description of the nice lady, glowy and bright, singing in an unknown language, flying away. It sounds like an angel, doesn't it? Story 6. I've been an EMT for over a decade, working the graveyard shift in the small town of Millbrook. You see a lot of strange things in this job, especially in the dead of night when the world feels a little off. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever come close to what happened last October. It was a typically cold New England fall night, the kind where the wind whispers through bare branches and makes you think of ghost stories. I was on shift with my partner, Jake, a rookie who'd been with us for about 6 months. Good kid, eager to learn, but still green around the edges. The call came in around 2 a.m. Dispatch said they'd received a landline call from 42 Elm Street, but there was no one on the other end, just silence. It happens sometimes. Old folks fall and can't reach the phone properly, that sort of thing. So Jake and I headed out, along with the local PD and fire department. Standard procedure for a wellness check. When we pulled up to 42 Elm, something felt wrong. The house was completely dark, not even a porch light on. It was an old Victorian, the kind that looks picturesque during the day, but downright sinister at night. Paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, overgrown yard. Classic haunted house material. Officer Ramirez from PD approached us as we got out of the ambulance. "Place looks abandoned," he said, shining his flashlight over the facade. "No power running to it either, according to dispatch." We did a quick sweep of the surrounding houses, making sure it wasn't a neighbor in distress. Nothing. After about 30 minutes, we called it in as a false alarm and headed back to the station. 2 hours later, the call came again. Same address, same silent line. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered as we pulled up to 42 Elm for the second time that night. This time, we were determined to get to the bottom of it. The fire chief, a gruff old guy named Bill, decided we should do a thorough search of the house. "Ramirez, you and your partner take the ground floor. My guys will sweep the second floor. You two," he pointed at Jake and me, "check out the basement." I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled about the basement assignment. There's something about old house basements that just creeps me out. But I wasn't about to let the rookie see me sweat, so I nodded and led the way. The front door creaked open with an ominous groan that echoed through the empty house. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and dusty floors. No furniture, no signs of life, just emptiness and a musty smell that spoke of years of abandonment. We found the basement door off the kitchen. It was slightly ajar, a gaping maw of darkness beyond. I glanced at Jake, saw the apprehension in his eyes, and gave him what I hoped was a reassuring nod. "After you, Proby," I said, trying to keep my voice light. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended. The beam of my flashlight revealed a typical old basement. Concrete floors, stone foundation walls, cobwebs in every corner. But there was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A heaviness to the air maybe, or a stillness that felt unnatural. We were about halfway across the room when it happened. The temperature dropped suddenly, drastically. I'm talking a good 20 degrees in the span of seconds. I could see my breath clouding in front of me. "Did you feel that?" Jake whispered, his voice tight with tension. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across concrete. It was coming from behind us, from the dark corner we just passed. I turned, sweeping my flashlight beam back the way we'd come. Nothing. Just empty space and dancing dust motes in the light. "Probably just rats," I said, more to convince myself than Jake. That's when Jake screamed. I whirled around to see him stumbling backward, eyes wide with terror. "Something grabbed me," he yelled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Something fucking grabbed my ankle." I didn't wait to see what it was. Training kicked in, and I grabbed Jake by the arm, hauling him towards the stairs. We took them two at a time, bursting out into the kitchen where we nearly collided with Ramirez and the fire crew. "What the hell happened down there?" Bill demanded, taking in our pale faces and Jake's shaking hands. Before I could answer, a cold draft washed over us. I saw Bill's eyes widen, watched as he shivered involuntarily. "Did anyone else feel that?" he asked, looking around at our group. One by one, we all nodded. Without another word, we filed out of the house and into the crisp night air. It felt like stepping out of a freezer and into a warm room. We stood in a circle on the overgrown lawn, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Ramirez broke the silence. "So, anyone want to tell me what the fuck just happened in there?" No one had an answer. We filed our reports, careful to stick to the facts. Abandoned house, possible squatter activity, nothing found. But we all knew there was more to it than that. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 hours later, as Jake and I were finishing up some paperwork at the station, the call came in again. 42 Elm Street, silent line. Dispatch sounded confused. "I know you guys already checked it out, but protocol says we have to send someone." I shared a look with Jake. The kids still looked shaken from our earlier experience. "We'll drive by," I told dispatch. "But we're not going inside without backup." The street was quiet as we pulled up to the house. Nothing had changed. Same dark windows, same overgrown yard. But as I killed the engine, I swear I saw a flicker of movement behind one of the upstairs windows. Just for a second, like someone passing by. Jake saw it too. "Tell me that was just a trick of the light," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wished I could, but I knew what I'd seen. We sat there for a good 10 minutes, engine off, just watching the house. Nothing moved. No sounds except for the whisper of wind through dead leaves. Finally, I started the ambulance. "Let's get out of here," I said. Jake didn't argue. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch. Pale, indistinct, barely there. Then we turned the corner, and it was gone. Jake quit a month after that night. Said the job wasn't for him. Can't say I blame him. This line of work, it changes you. Makes you see the world differently. Makes you question what's real and what isn't. But me, I'm still here. Still answering calls in the dead of night. Because for every inexplicable, terrifying moment like 42 Elm, there are 100 times when we make a real difference. When we save a life, ease someone's pain, bring a little light into the darkness.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.